kick things off. Hi and welcome everyone to Making Space, Psychedelics Today in our career, past, present, and future. We're so grateful for everyone who's joined here today. I see we've already got some guests trickling in, almost 20 people. So thank you so much for showing up and being on time. I also want to thank our panelists, who I'll introduce here in a moment. We're just really excited to have a wonderful conversation today that explores the intersection of psychedelic usage in queer culture. Allow myself to introduce myself. My name is Kirby Duncan. I identify as a gay male and I use the pronouns he, him. I've worked with a number of brands in the psychedelic space on the marketing side of things, and I'm really grateful to have been able to partner with Psychedelics Today to curate this conversation. My intention is to bring my passion for dismantling societal stigmas surrounding psychedelics and ultimately creating a shame-free space of education and dialogue that embraces the diverse range of human psychedelic experiences. So I'm really honored to be here today, guiding this conversation among our esteemed panelists. And quite honestly, I'm genuinely excited to learn alongside each and everyone here today. Hey, Shelby. Welcome. So today we are going to be exploring the complex relationship between psychedelics, queer identity, and the creation of spaces where individuals can belong through the lens of our past, present, and future. So throughout this webinar, we'll discuss thought-provoking topics that shape our understanding of this intersection, examining how psychedelics have shaped the queer experience through history, their potential for a transformative future, and we'll delve into what it means to create spaces for psychedelic and sacred plant medicine usage that foster a sense of belonging, catalyzing personal and collective growth. We'll be shedding light on the historical significance of psychedelics within queer communities, their use within professional, societal, and ancestral contexts. But ultimately, throughout this webinar, our aim is to educate, to offer a shift in perspective on these topics, and hopefully inspire action as we discuss how psychedelic journeys can fuel deeper engagement with social justice efforts, inclusivity, and community building. So without further ado, I want to welcome our distinguished panelists. I'll say a bit about each one of it, but today we've got Dr. Alex Belser, Dr. Bia Labate, Florie, St.Aime, and Shelby Clark, representing researchers, facilitators, retreat operators, and clinical practitioners. Their diverse expertise and perspectives are undoubtedly going to shed light on the multifaceted nature of the topics we'll explore today. So I'm going to go in alphabetical order. So first we have Dr. Alex Belser. He is a renowned clinical scientist, licensed psychologist, and a leader in psychedelic research. He has over 20 years of experience, and Alex co-founded the NYU Psychedelic Research Group. He's pioneered therapies with substances like psilocybin and MDMA, and currently conducts research at Yale exploring their therapeutic potential of psilocybin for OCD. As the founding president of the Nautilus Society, the first nonprofit dedicated to psychedelic medicine on the East Coast, Alex has been instrumental in advancing the psychedelic fields. With academic backgrounds ranging from Georgetown, Cambridge, Columbia, NYU, and Yale, Alex brings a wealth of knowledge to the intersection of psychedelics and queer studies. Their work has been featured in renowned media outlets, including The Guardian, Rolling Stones, Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, and he's also a lead editor and author of the new book, Queering Psychedelics, which I'll speak to in just a moment. But please join me in welcoming Dr. Alex Belser to our panel. We're thrilled to have you. Alex, feel free to take a moment, say hello, and name anything that I missed.
Thank you for the lovely introduction. It's really sweet to be here. Happy Pride, everybody. It's sweet to be here with my editor, Dr. Bia Labate from Queering Psychedelics, and my friends Florie, and who's been teaching for our program. It's really lovely to be here, and we have representation all the way from Costa Rica at the Jungle neighborhood. So it's really nice to be with you all. Kirby, how long should I make an opening remark for? A few minutes, or would
take a couple minutes? That's great.
I just want to say that we just got back, some of us, from the Denver conference, which was 12,000 people, and we had a queer mixer event where literally we were worried that maybe only a dozen or two would show up, and there were hundreds of queer psychedelic psychonauts in attendance, making new connections and friends and potentially collaborating. So there's an exponentially growing interest in the crossover between lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, gender fluid identities and psychedelics. And I think for good reason. There's been, as we look deeper and deeper into this, I think there's a lot of erased history. I'm passionate about psychotherapy. One of the things I'm really excited about is the prospect of, as we are in Pride, even this event was, denounced publicly online, and people decided to unsubscribe from Psychedelics Today because they decided to host a webinar about LGBTQ issues in psychedelic research and practice. And this happens all the time. I get a lot of very unpleasant messages from people that the anti-woke mob is coming for psychedelics. And while I appreciate that people have different perspectives, I also think it's important for us as psychedelic researchers to know our own histories. One of the things that's been happening, as everyone knows, is there's been just a spate of anti-trans bills, in particular in legislatures across the country, hundreds of them, in fact. And I think that one of with this trans panic that's been happening, which is of a lineage with what I grew up with in an extraordinarily transphobic, homophobic society, we're seeing increases in physical attacks on trans folks on the street, on queer folks in my hometown of New York and in Brooklyn and Manhattan. And it really affects our feelings of safety. When we had our book launch for Queering Psychedelics at World of Wonder in Los Angeles, which is the production studio that does RuPaul's Drag Race, we had to have, metal detectors and people swiping people down for fear that there was going to be violence. And that's not the world that I want to cultivate with each of you. And my specialization, besides doing research with psychedelics, is on preventing suicide in LGBTQ youth. My dissertation was on all of the things that happen for queer youth. And we know that there's this thing called sexual minority stress. It's documented in many hundreds of studies where queer people as kids throughout the course of their lives are subjected to literally thousands of messages from sometimes rejecting parents, peers on the school playground or in the locker room, experiences of bullying and harassment, experiences of inferiority and discrimination from teachers and in their places of worship in churches and other places in their communities, all the way through to like me growing up unable to get married, inadequate healthcare, no protections in employment. And this leads to internalized processes of not just these experiences of discrimination and stigma, but internalized processes of higher rates of shame, self-hatred. And I work on this in my practice working with queer people. We see a lot of doubt that people feel like there's something wrong with them, that the problem is with them, rather than that the problem is with a transphobic and homophobic and racist and classist and oppressive society. And so these internalized processes get expressed in, as we see in the queer communities, higher rates of depression, much higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of problematic substance use. And I think that psychedelics hold potentially a key to helping alleviate some of these issues for the community in terms of relieving suffering. I think that we'll see that psilocybin might be a really good treatment for depression, and that MDMA is already in the work that I've done working with queer people in the MAP studies, an incredible treatment, not just for PTSD, but for internalized homophobia and internalized transphobia. And so it could be, I think, psychedelics in the way that they melt down structures of our story and identity, and let there be an opening for a new cultivation of self in a way that could be more affirming from the clinicians and the culture, more loving of oneself, is extremely powerful, potentially really radically powerful. And the psychedelic community can be in a leadership role here. I think in order to do that, I'll just close by saying the psychedelic community can look, and I've spoken to this and others to the past, of psychedelics being used in a widespread way through conversion therapies to convert gay people and trans people, what were called transsexuals in the 1950s through 70s, into straight people, to break down their ego and then to psychologically build it back up through a shock therapy treatment to becoming what we're seeing as like the correct persona model of a straight cisgender person who has satisfying sexual relationships with persons of the opposite sex. And the psychedelic community has a lot of work to do to deal with the erasure of that history, which continues to this day, I think, in the medical practices that are often very rejecting when people walk into doctors' offices, when they walk into psychedelic clinics, and we can do a lot better. So my pronouns are he and him, they and them. I identify as a white cis man, and I have quite a bit of privilege in this area. And I also am learning as I go and learning about these histories and trying to figure out a way to work with you all to build a different future for us and for the queer youth of tomorrow. So it's nice to be here with you all. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. Next, we have Bia Labate. Bia is a queer Brazilian anthropologist based in San Francisco, specializing in the study of psychedelic plant medicines, drug policy, shamanism, ritual, religion, and social justice. With a Ph.D. in social anthropology from the University of Campinas, Bia has dedicated her career to exploring the profound connections between psychedelics, rituals, and their impacts on social justice. She serves as the executive director of the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines and is a public education and culture specialist at MAPS. Bia's extensive research and publications have significantly shaped the discourse around psychedelics. Her expertise and insights are invaluable as we navigate the intersection of psychedelic usage in queer culture. So please join me with a warm welcome for Bia. We're so excited to have you here, and I'll pass it off to you for a moment of hello.
Hello, bom dia, buenos dias. Greetings from Lonely Territory, Bay Area. Just arriving also yesterday from this crazy journey called Psychedelic Science 2023. It was a real intense conference, quite overwhelming. I'm still processing everything and still waking up. I want to wish everybody a happy Pride and to say that it's feel good to be living in San Francisco, the queer capital of the world, with my partner running a nonprofit talking about queer issues, coming back from a mainstream conference where we have our little queer stand and flag in the middle of it. And so trying to cultivate gratitude and pleasure. I want to acknowledge and realize how good it is that we can follow our dreams and create, hope for a better future, for a better tomorrow, for all of us in community to accept ourselves better. Alex and Clancy have been influential people in my own process of healing my internal homophobia. I very much agree to everything that Alex have said and have started to realize as an adult how much that of the bad feelings that I had constantly about everything, which I attributed to existential pain and just like the mysteries and challenges of being alive as a human. And I thought I had a lot of existential pain and anguish. I think a lot had to do with this queer identity that was really not very well, resolved inside me. And so I have been working on the last several years with the support of my psychedelic community and my friends in California and my partner to feel a better, more whole and feel a better human and a better person. And the way that I have done this as an anthropologist, when I'm curious about something, I decide to read and research. It's so original. So I just decide if I am really interested in a topic, I get obsessed and I start to read and talk to people, and I want to create conferences and articles. And so my queer healing has been create a queer conversation. That has been how I have dealt. That's my integration. The integration of an anthropologist is to create studies and discussions around this topic. So through it has been a process that I decided to come out of the closet and celebrate that in a conference, Queer in Psychedelics, in 2019, and have since been reading and trying to promote conversations. And that goes very much hand in hand with my need to keep on cultivating my own process of self-love. And it's just wonderful because the more love I give to myself and the more I give to this community, the more I get back and the more I feel good about it. So it's just been really great journey. And I want to say that in Queer in Psychedelics, we had a very strong panel, as Alex said, in the last day during the Chacruna. Chacruna had a whole track in one day, and we had this queer panel that all these people came in, and Alex had asked how many people had heard about conversion therapies, and like everybody raised their hand. I mean, of course, it's a highly biased sample because it's people that like these things, but this wouldn't have happened in 2017 or 2013 or 2010, which were the previous iterations of that conference. So we say in Brazil, the works of little ants, because a little ant, each one, formiguinhas, they carry their little leaves, and then in the end, they make this little castle of empire that I forgot the word, but you know what I mean, where the ants live. And then, you know, it's just the work of every single one every day carrying a little leaf. So I feel that we are like that in the work we're doing. Chacruna is like, you know, you have a farmer's market, and every day, every weekend you have the farmer's market, and you go and you put your stand out and you sell your vegetables, and maybe some days the tomatoes are smashed, and maybe some days they are looking nice, and maybe some days there's no tomatoes. But whether it's raining or not raining, or whether, you know, you want to go or you're in a bad mood or not, you just go and you create that practice. And then you have that audience, and then you have that vibe, that contribution that you're making to the world. So that's what we're trying to do by cultivating these discussions with queer issues. And it was also just especially beautiful that we did a book launch, and then we had this line of people, and you had all this like different characters, gay, trans, bi, non-binary, like everybody with their little book, and coming to us like humbly, oh, so nice to meet you, and so good to get your, you know, and then they sat and each one like told us a little story, and we signed the book. And so it's, you can see that people are looking for a community and for like references for people to mirror in, and that doing that contribution feels so good because people are paying attention and people are learning, and there is ways to teach and to transform reality. And, you know, we're broke all the time, complaining about lack of money and complaining about the hardship of running a nonprofit and all the paradoxes of the $millions of venture capitalists and startups and how hard it is to do the work we do, but it's extremely rewarding. And I think it is making a difference. And I want to invite everybody to be part of this movement, to stand in solidarity with us. I also do think that the United States plays a leadership role that is really important. As a Brazilian, I think Brazil is probably the country that has world top murders of trans people in the world, and the importance of this progressive movement happening and influencing, you know, countries that are very patriarchal and Catholic and still really based on gender stereotypes and oppressive. I've lived both in Mexico and Brazil, and I feel much liberated in the United States, where I feel there is more tolerance, at least, of course, San Francisco, but anyway, to different ways of being a man or a woman, or even to the ideas of what is a man and a woman. And so, yeah, just happy to be here. I have a lot of thoughts about whether psychedelics can heal queer issues or not, but we can leave that for the discussion. And so just want to give a shout out that I was in Breckenridge with Joe Moore yesterday. And I'm a new fan of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, and much love to all of you.
Awesome. Thank you, Bia. Now let's direct our attention to our next panelist, Florie St.Aime, a remarkable clinician and advocate for liberation-based practices. Florie identifies as a fat, Black, queer, cis woman and a relationship anarchist, rooted in the belief that true change begins with addressing social constructs rather than individuals. Raised in the Lenapehoking, particularly the Carnegie People's Land known as Brooklyn, New York, Florie brings a rich cultural heritage, one generation removed from Haiti's landmass known as Africa. With her unique perspective, Florie engages in various forms of activism, group facilitation, workshops, individual counseling, and sacred space holding. Her approach centers around liberation practices that encourage curiosity, resistance, and care towards all being. As a liberation-based clinician, she challenges societal norms and fosters human connection as radical action. So please join me with warmly welcoming Florie St.Aime.
Hello. I have to start with, I am not home. I'm not in Lenapehoking territory. I am been stuck here in Denver. I was also not at the conference. I was at a wedding, but I am stuck here in Denver, and so I am feeling the absence of my grounding today. And so I know that's probably going to show up in how I'm speaking and what I'm saying. I feel a little topsy-turvy, and I think that says a lot about how important belonging to land is, because I have been here for like a week now, and I should be fine, I guess, logically, but limbically, my whole system is kind of like, why are we still not home? What's happening? And so I'm really feeling into that. And I think that really leads into why I think it's important to have conversations like this. I think of myself as a doubt spreader, like a doubt planner, like I spread seeds of doubt, because I think there is something really important about noticing where what we think is happening is not what's happening, or we want to believe is happening is not happening. And I think it's easy to do a they and them piece when we're talking about queering psychedelics. So what does that mean for psychedelics relationship to queerness? That we have to start to recognize the parts of us that actually align with the oppression that we are also being harmed by. And that tends to be my where I move in the world. I'm really curious about, where do I actually align with the same oppressions that harm me? What are the degrees that I actually encourage or engage in that same oppressive behavior that I see in others that is maybe more extreme, but I have a degree of that. And so a lot of my work is around, how do we actually start to notice the ways that we are, that internalization Alex was mentioning, but more than internalizing, we enact. And so I hope that today I get to talk about how that shows up, even if I'm feeling a little all over the place, that it comes out really clearly for y'all.
Amazing. Thank you, Florie. And lastly, let's welcome Shelby Clark, an entrepreneur and seed stage investor with a special focus on mental health and psychedelic therapies. He's also the founder and CEO of the Jungle Gayborhood, an LGBTQ plus retreat center hosting sacred plant medicine retreats in Costa Rica. Shelby has created a unique space dedicated to fostering community, personal growth, and holistic well-being, as the retreat center provides a sanctuary for individuals seeking self-discovery and healing within the LGBTQ plus community. Shelby is also a partner at Lionheart Ventures, where he invests in supporting companies that are at the forefront of mental health and the expansion of human consciousness. And beyond that, he's also a yoga and meditation guide passionate about promoting self-discovery and healing. So please join me with a warm welcome for Shelby Clark.
Okay, here we go. I'll try that again. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the intro, Kirby. It's so nice to be here with the other speakers as well. I resonate with so much of what each of you began with. I was also at the MAPS conference in Denver last week, and it was a chaotic and very powerful experience. And you know, I think that I felt that it seemed this movement is moving sort of from the psychedelic movement is moving sort of from the fringe into, you know, sort of a powerful movement. with a lot of great energy, and also seeing the really strong queer presence at the conference was also really inspiring to me, and helped me just to realize that as the queer group, we may not be we may be sexual minorities, but we are not alone. And I'm very honored to be on this path to create safe spaces for growth, reflection, and expansion for the LGBT community with each of you. So it's an honor to be here. It's a little bit of like my personal story, which ties into some of the things that I'm working on today. I grew up in Denver, in a suburb of Denver, in a very comfortable middle class household, as a gay man, and I was made fun of a lot growing up, and I think that it led me to have this feeling of not loving myself, of not feeling belonging in who I was, and the way I responded to that was being an overachiever, sort of very common story of the velvet rage. I got great grades. I was a good student, a good athlete, and sort of continued on this path of like trying to achieve as a way of loving myself. And things sort of came crumbling down a while later. It worked for me quite well for a while, and then after a while, a company that I had started failed, and sort of all the ways that I was getting positive feedback and validation from the external world sort of came crashing down, and I was wondering what do I do now? And in this depression, I went and did a yoga teacher training, and really connected with a lot of these practices that really turned the camera around. Instead of looking outside for people to tell me that I was okay, really cultivated practices of expression that brought me into my body, into the moment, and brought me into a feeling of self-love. And at the end of that, I did my first psilocybin journey, and the whole world melted away, and I felt connected to everything. And it's very difficult to feel alone when you feel connected to everything. And so as I continued on this, this was a really powerful experience for me, and it's really shaped a lot of my life since then. And as I continued on my own personal path with the medicine, I found that I was almost always the only or one of the only queer people in the room. Nobody really understood this concept of growing up and just not feeling like they fit in. I remember going through a sort of traumatic breakup from a throuple and trying to discuss that in an integration circle with a bunch of straight people, and it just wasn't resonating. They were just looking at me like I was crazy. And so I just had this theory about like, what would it be like to create containers of queer people to come together, to do this work together, to people who can understand some part of your story, and can be a part of this growth and healing in a relational process together. And so a little over 2 years ago, we hosted our first queer retreat as a bit of an experiment or sort of a workshop, and had just a fantastic response. And so we've continued on those, creating containers and retreats for growth exploration within the queer community, some of them featuring facilitators who carry plant medicine or other medicines, and some other containers as well. And we've also built a really beautiful retreat center in the jungle of Costa Rica. I just felt so inspired by this land here. What we built here is with really beautiful bamboo, which came right from the land right next door. It was built really in harmony with the land, and it's really easy to feel connected to this land, and an opportunity to learn how to live in connection with the land, how to learn from the indigenous people of this land, the Baruka people, and it's just really been a fantastic experience to be creating these groups and containers. And so I'm really excited to talk about some of our experience that we've had, and some of the challenges that we've experienced, and some of the things that we've learned. And really great to be in community with the other people on this panel as well, to be continuing to explore how to create spaces of belonging for the LGBT community. The other hat that I wear that Kirby mentioned is that I'm also an early stage investor. investing in companies working in supporting mental health and specifically psychedelic medicine. That's the largest area that we've been investing in. And so again, just last week at the conference, it was really great to see so much movement and energy and just yeah. So excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here. Really quickly, Alex and Bia had mentioned this, but this is the Queering Psychedelic book, not a plug for this webinar, but it will be brought up throughout. I have some questions about it as it pertains, so I just kind of wanted the audience to understand if it wasn't clear what we were talking about. And yeah, speaking of the audience, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. You're an important part of being here. We want your voices heard. So throughout the conversation, I encourage you to ask questions, put it in the Q&A. I'm going to do my best to check them out. I see we've already got one in here. So please don't hesitate to chime in. And we will be sure to bring them up, if not during the conversation, at the end for a Q&A portion. I also want to acknowledge that we've got a rich and diverse set of topics to cover today, and I'm going to do my best to monitor time and keep us progressing so we can hit historical context, what it means to belong, the future of the movement, all of that. So panelists, I've decided I'll bring in just the silent mushroom if I'm hoping that we can sort of kind of move things on. That's my new trick. And I'm really excited. So, before we go any further, I think we need to take a moment to acknowledge and feel into the current state of oppression against trans bodies and the LGBTQIA+ community, and recognize the ongoing need for social justice and inclusivity. What we're seeing today, we've seen in similar shapes and sizes. And before I ask some of our panelists to speak to our history of oppression through a psychedelic lens, I'd love to open it up to our panelists if they have anything to say to address what we're experiencing today as a queer collective. Specifically, Florie, I'd love to kind of hand this off to you. I've heard you speak a few times and had time to connect with you about your approach to using psychedelics to feel deeply present, to create sort of actionable anger. And I think it's really powerful. So could you please elaborate on what that means to you?
Yeah, thanks. There's I guess two main responses people have when you say can we take a moment and just feel into the deeply public, deeply performative oppression that we're seeing against trans bodies across the nation. And so there's this rage that can come up really easily, so angry, there's so much pent up in there. And what I instantly feel is a lot of grief. And I really welcome people, because psychedelics has so often actually brought me to a grief that takes a long time for me to really translate in my body about how much I feel hopeless when these moments are happening. There's a hopelessness that's real, and there's a hopelessness that I think we in queer community and activist communities want people to move past so they can do movement and they can do action. But actually that hopelessness has often brought me to what are the places in me that I actually do have some real ability to be with, that I'm really hurt by this. I live here. It's actually really painful to be here, and to then start to notice well, if I'm really hurt by this, I have to look at how is this possible? And it's possible because we've done it to many different people. I'm a Black queer person. I can't be queer without being Black. And so we have to, that hopelessness starts to look back and be wow, this is something that happens all the time. And this is a new target. And when I look at it in that way, I'm I feel super hopeless. And that way I really need to go towards community. I need someone to help me figure out what to do with all the pain that no one else is talking about, but wants me to be angry and moving and doing things and fighting and because that's ultimately a bunch of reaction, which is what a lot of these are too, right? And so I don't want to do the same thing they're doing, which is reactionary and like based on nothing else but trying to like get back at things that they think are taking from them. I don't want to do that too. And so I'm really feeling into like, how do we actually build spaces where we could feel like the hopelessness, the grief, the heartbreak of the time, and be like, what do we do that looks different than reacting? What do we do that's different than like, I want to get back at you because that's more of the same thing. And actually, how do we build things that are outside of them, that we don't have to go to them for validation? And like, how do we support each other? How do we do mutual aid? How do we actually bring the things that we need and say like, oh, the system's not made to support us anyway. And when I feel hopeless, I'm clear about that. And I'm not trying to get them to do something for me. I actually turn away from the system and be like, all right, then what do we need? Because we can't look over there. They're not going to help us. They're obviously going to actively try to harm us. And so those are the initial feels of like what I hope people experience when they're like bringing into this moment, that it isn't just like, I'm so angry, I want to fight. That too, we need that, I'm not taking away from that. But there's also the like, wow, this is a really long history in this country, in this culture, in the West. And so I think I just need to turn away from them for a little bit and go to those who really love me, care for me, and figure out what do we need to support the people around us, and stop looking to these big governments and big systems and big people to do, but they're not going to do it.
Thanks for that. Anyone else on the panel that would love to share their insight and perspective on this? All right. Alex, you have an extensive experience in the field of psychedelic research. You've contributed to the development of psychedelic-assisted therapy models in great deal. And even recently, I listened to your podcast with Psychedelics Today. And one topic that really resonated was your exploration of the history of queer oppression and the parallels with the challenges we face today. Could you share some insight into the historical aspects of queer oppression and how we're witnessing similar tactics against the trans community?
And the last part was, and how we're witnessing similar
tactics against
tactics. Yeah. I think that the psychedelic community has rainbow skeletons in our closet, and that it is of a piece with broader cultural oppression and the lineage of oppression I think that Florie is referencing and speaking to, against trans folks and queer folks. I said in Denver, like, I don't really like talking about this, but I had been going to psychedelic conferences for a long time, and I really, was learning as a student of the history of psychedelics and the whole story, the sort of like official story, that there was a lot of psychedelic research in the 50s and 60s, and then Nixon signs the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, and everything kind of goes into the underground, and now there's a renaissance, or people prefer words like resurgence. What I never learned until just literally in the last handful of years, after 15 years of going to conferences and people talking about like minuscule details about psychedelic therapies from the 60s, is that psychedelic conversion therapy was like the thing to do. It was the mainstream treatment in the DSM 2 and 3. Homosexuality was deemed a pathological psychological disorder, and the psychedelic leaders of the time were on board, and in fact celebrated psychedelics like psilocybin, mescaline, and LSD as tools to, and I think my profession is complicit in this as a psychologist, tools to break down the ego of the disordered individual who was what was considered a pervert. Sexual deviant was usually a term that was used at the time. And it wasn't just like one or two people or a few cases. It seems to have been profoundly widespread and then rapidly erased. And so we've been kind of going on an archaeology project looking for the details of it. I've been looking a lot at a personal hero of mine, Dr. Stan Groff, who, when you go back and read his book Beyond the Brain and LSD Psychotherapy and other works, he's very clear that he says that the most common challenging experience that he sees in his LSD treatments is people's fear of dying Number two, fear of going insane forever. And number three, fear of being gay. Fear of being homosexual was the number three concern that he had. And he wrote about assuring that he treated what he called male homosexuality and female homosexuality as disorders. And he linked it to, for men, fear of vagina dentata in a psychoanalytic model of like the threatening woman's vagina. And he linked it to, for male homosexuality, unresolved past life gestalt of being a woman in a past life, that if they got through in his system of BPM, birth perineal matrices 3, that the male homosexual could resolve his homosexuality. Similarly, of BPM 4 for lesbianism, these are all his terms, working with female homosexuality, that their homosexuality was caused by a profound dearth of womanly, motherly affection, and is therefore pathological and could be treated through psychedelic conversion therapy. And this is profoundly offensive. It is not unusual necessarily for the time. I mean, it's both a transpersonal and a psychoanalytic response to conceptualizing what being queer was, being at the time. And he focused mainly on sexuality and not on gender, as far as I can tell. But it was of a piece with Masterson Houston, who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience, like the canonical book. They used mescaline, and they said that to treat people leading towards quote heterosexualization. Ram Dass, who spoke at Psychedelic Science 2010, never actually officially used the word gay or bi to describe himself, but he published. You can go into PubMed and see. He was a big fan of psychedelic conversion therapy, using psilocybin to treat gay men to have satisfying sexual relationships with their women partners. It's in the literature. He published on it. There are many conversion therapy stories from France, the United Kingdom, Canada, throughout the United States. Tim Leary, the Pied Piper of LSD, said that LSD is a specific cure for homosexuality. In Playboy magazine, he was very happy about it. Hollywood Hospital had a conversion therapy program. In a recent article in Lancet Psychiatry, there's a program to treat I think what we would consider gay, queer, and lesbian women in the UK. There was really brutal shock therapy, very high dose treatment in France and potentially elsewhere, of up to 800 micrograms of LSD, which is 8 tabs of acid, 1,200 milligrams of mescaline, treating 2 boys who were found kissing and then locked on a psych unit for weeks and repeatedly exposed over and over and over again in an intentional shock therapy program to break down their distorted ego as it was seen and build it back up in a straight mold. And I believe that these harms are heartbreaking and of a similar nature to the harms that were perpetrated by the CIA's MK Ultra program, which we have heard tons about, to harms against BIPOC people and formerly incarcerated people in psychedelic research, to harms of sexual boundary transgressions by psychedelic facilitators, which we have an active discourse about. But there has been a very little attention paid, as far as I can tell, from leading cisgender and straight psychedelic researchers and leaders about psychedelic conversion therapy. And it would be one thing, and I'll sort of wrap up. I think that what we are seeing is that this history was hidden because we are ashamed. I think the straight leaders are ashamed of it and do not want to talk about it. And it doesn't fit with the narrative that psychedelics were good and then they were quashed by a bad government, and now that they're good again and can help people. The psychedelic community has its own participation, as I think active enactment of violence and harms against queer people, that continued to the perpetration of the male-female dyad, which introduces totalizing ideas of gender into the clinic room. That was normal up until 5 years ago, and even now it continues today. It's in filings with the FDA. It continues and is perpetrated in ketamine and psilocybin clinical research, where we don't ask for people's pronouns on intake. The most common thing that I hear from patients, from participants in these trials, is that they go through an entire trial and they never even tell their clinician that they're queer. They just don't even come out because they don't feel safe or comfortable enough. And so they work on other issues But there's this like, they don't even tell their straight clinicians or their cis clinicians that they're dealing with this basic aspect of their identity. And because I don't think that they're told, and I learned this from you, Florie, that they're in a quote safe space, but it's not really a safer space for them. They don't feel safe enough to be themselves. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and I think there are beautiful ways for us to do the work and to grieve and to also kind of point to our own psychedelic histories.
Thank you, Alex. Bia, as an anthropologist with extensive work.
Sorry, Kirby, can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm curious, Stan Groff is still alive. Some of these other leaders are. I'm curious, has anyone ever asked him or others about this? I'm just curious how they would respond to it.
I've approached him through an intermediary. Someone else did also last year, and he has had a stroke and declined. We've approached him actually again this last week, motivated from Denver, and we will see what the response may be through multiple channels.
Thank you. Bia, as an anthropologist with extensive work across drug policy and social justice, could you expand on what you've seen through this historical context?
Yeah, I guess I could talk a little bit about, just a basic anthropological commentary. I want to evoke when I actually met my wife, Clancy, and we met because she was doing a research about gay and lesbian people drinking ayahuasca and their feelings about their own identity and healing and that kind of thing. And I was an anthropologist living in Brazil that had been doing a lot of research around ayahuasca, and I had a newsletter. And she asked me if I could put a note in my newsletter about trying to get some research subjects for her research. And so I agreed and I put it out. And then we met in person for the first time in Psychedelic Science 2010. And we had a kind of argument. She says that she was overwhelmed because she thought I was very aggressive, and at the same time, she thought I was very attractive. So it was confusing for her, but it was basically around, she wanted to study how psychedelics could help queer people. And I had a real problem with that because for me, that question made no sense as an anthropologist. That was more a question of a psychologist. And I kept on telling her that, psychedelics can't do anything. It all depends on the context. And that research made no sense, that you wanted to get people from different contexts and lump them all together. Anyway, we have a lot of discussions like that in this house between anthropology and psychology. But what I want to say about this topic is I really think that context is influential, and it's entirely different if you're going to a St.Aime or UDV church that you have a very patriarchal culture that separates men and women, that only, like especially in the UDV, only men get to be leaders. And in the St.Aime, you put the virgins on a physical separate place in the ceremony, and you have a culture that, it's the sacred family, the divine masculine and feminine, which stresses a lot of gender stereotypes. Your experience will be influenced by that context. If you're drinking in indigenous cultures that have a certain understanding of gender roles and sexual identity, etc., that is going to be influential. And so I think, one point that I want to stress is that we really have to care about the context of psychedelic ceremonies, because that is as important as the psychedelic itself. You can still have a lot of liberation insights and a lot of good stuff coming out of oppressive contexts. That is within the realm of psychedelics. It can happen. You can be in a very patriarchal, homophobic context and still have some insights that are good for you as a queer person and that heals you. but maybe also not. Maybe you can go into the other side of things and start to think that you are, wrong and bad. And we have seen a lot of this conversion therapies inside psychedelics, people using psychedelics. In St.Aime, I have seen, people that are queer trying to get married and then living some kind of like celibate marriages, thinking that sex is just not necessary for them anymore. Obviously, they don't want to have sex with somebody of the opposite sex because they are queer. So they get into this trip that, I'm going to be like a celibate person and I'm going to have my marriage that is, spiritual, or people even wanting to have children because they feel that's right, because they are in that context. And so I just really want to put it out there that it's not just the psychedelic. It really depends on the context around it. And I also want to complexify the very idea of psychedelic healing, because I'm mainly a person that comes from the world of ayahuasca and also peyote, but okay, I have done peyote, mushrooms, ayahuasca. I have done much less like LSD or MDMA. I'm more coming from the world of plant medicines, and I was born and raised in Brazil, lived there until I was 39, and then lived and worked 8 years in Mexico. So all my references are less, let's say, Burning Man in the US, more like ceremony and ritual, Brazil, Mexico, Peru, that kind of thing. The culture that I've been raised in, which I also, we're talking about psychedelics, like going from all this spectrum. I am more coming from this world of shamanism, ritual religion, indigenous people, traditional uses of plant medicines. And the understandings that we have about sacred plants or plant medicine or whatever you want to call them is that there is always in there, the good and the bad, the light and the shadow. And it's really complex because, sacred plants can teach you, but they can also trick you. And they can show you healing, but they can also confuse you. I mean, it's as we say in Portuguese, estudo fino. It's a fine research or study. And so it's a whole process of a lifetime to get to understand the messages that you're getting and be able to navigate that. And then the whole other discussion is, how do you integrate that? So I just wanted to say that, it can be complicated, not always helps, but it can also help. So it's just some complexity and nuance. Thank you.
No, thank you. A lot of what you said sets a great foundation for sort of the next part of our conversation and the need for the creation of more inclusive spaces. When I was first crafting this conversation, I was ready to safe space, hashtag the whole thing. And I think we can all agree it's a word that's used a lot, but I had a really great conversation with Florie ahead of this event and got a profound shift that invited me to move away from, focusing on creating safe spaces towards creating spaces of belonging. So Florie, I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the distinction between safe spaces and why we should be thinking about creating spaces of belonging.
Yeah, fun. I think, Bia, what you said about context leads into this. Like, what tells us we had a good experience? Like, what tells us we had a successful psychedelic experience? And a lot of that are that there are a lot of rules, one around human supremacy, like our happiness being on the planet is what we should have. Like, we're entitled to that. We're entitled to feeling good. We're entitled to feeling, it's very Western, but it is also something that we've exported everywhere, so many places. Even when we talk about indigenous medicine, we also have to think about how they've been impacted by Western ideology, Western money, Western influence too, right? And so for me, safe place is really continuing to feed into this belief that in human supremacy, that we should feel comfortable, like we should feel good. And that's good medicine work. Like if I leave feeling better about myself, then I've successfully had a good journey. Or if I feel more confident, then that means I did it. And that's very Western, but there's examples of that in other ways of even like if I don't want to have children, but I leave saying I want to have kids, like who decides what the moral compass is of what we should be working towards? And the question is that the answer really is that has been influenced deeply by Judeo-Christian beliefs and deeply by this belief that getting bigger, scaling, and having more people is safe. Like the more people we have, the more alignment we have with other people is safety. And I often bring up, like, if we think about like nomadic people before the Ice Age, who were like going around sharing all their resources because like that's just what happened. And then the world melts and then people start growing their own food and they have to start protecting their food. And so they like sit around, protect their food, and then nomads are still around and they're targets. And so they start inviting people into their society through marriage and through other institutions like that, so that they all could protect their food, like protect their things, protect what they're entitled to. And that belief that we get to be still in the world, not be impacted by the world, that we get to control what happens and invite others into the control of what happens, tends to be what we call safe. But that's not actually the same thing as belonging. Like I'm here and without doing anything, I deserve to be here. And I don't think that can happen on a large scale. I know we cannot do that on a large scale. Safety is something that is so not real, one, but belonging is so real. And we only learn that when we actually hear from individual people, individual small groups, what helps you belong. And that means belonging has to change every time we sit with a new person. It has to change every time we're in a new group. We cannot standardize belonging. And that's why Safe Place is constantly trying to standardize this feeling of like, we belong here. And that's impossible because we are such an eclectic global society now, right? Like even if we were to go into places that we call small villages, the impact of Western of the Western ideology, even in there are variations that we have to take into account when we talk about how do you feel like you belong. And so to me, I think it's a question about like, why do we go to psychedelics so that we could feel good or entitled? And instead, like, how do we learn, what do I need to feel like I'm connected to somebody else? Or I'm connected to the land I'm on. I feel connected to something else that's not just my own suffering and pain. And then how do I communicate that? And do I have places that can receive that communication and be like, okay, then let's shift for you. Like we're gonna shift for what you need. And that's belonging. It's like, I'm willing to be impacted by you. I'm willing to shift and make something different for you. And the way that psychedelics is coming out in our medical industrial complex, the medical industrial complex has never been made to shift for individual needs or small groups' needs. It's always been made to make you fit into something it wants you to be. And so I do think we have to be really curious as to why we like to throw around words like safe space or like inclusive or things like that, when actually the system is not made to be inclusive. It's made to make you fit. And we're going to have to figure out for ourselves then, if this system, again, I'm repeating the same thing because it's my broken record. If this system only wants to make me fit into its ideas of safe and good and belonging, then I think I need to learn what I actually need and then find the places that are willing to shift for me and let me belong and bring me in. And that I'm willing to do that for those people that place the land, the non-human beings of the place too. And so the belonging I love, safe place I hate, and belonging, big picture, belonging cannot be scaled. It cannot be scaled up. It cannot be expanded. It is something that's deeply small, deeply personal, deeply intimate.
Thank you, Florie. Yeah, it's particular to each and every space. And speaking of spaces, Shelby, as the founder of the Jungle Neighborhood, you've been holding a variety of queer retreats, some with sacred plant medicines and some not. But as one of the first LGBTQ plus retreat centers, I'm sure you've experienced a great deal about what it means to belong in different groups and how it may or may not change with each container. So could you tell us a little bit about your experience of building these containers and some of your maybe biggest learnings?
Okay, sorry about that. Here we go. Thanks, Kirby, and Florie, thank you so much for your remarks and comments as well. They resonate really deeply with a lot of the things that we've been learning through experience here in the Jungle Neighborhood. I think we began really trying to make safe spaces. And I think what we've learned is belonging is one of the most critical things to actually be focusing on. And a concept of belonging, it consistently comes up in almost every retreat or container that we host. I remember the first time it came up, it was during a week-long queer male identifying retreat that we were hosting. And we had two ayahuasca ceremonies, and there's a day between the two ceremonies. And in that day between the two ceremonies, one of the participants came up and pulled me aside and just said, I just don't fit in here. I think I need to leave. Like I just don't belong in this place. And I didn't know how to respond. And so what we did was, I invited the person to, if they, to share this with some other people or the group. And in the next sort of group setting, the person had the courage to say, I don't feel like I belong here. And so I asked the group, I said, does anyone else feel this way? And about almost half of the people actually raised their hand and said that they felt like they didn't belong. And it really created this really, and this is in a space that had been really created to make people feel safe, right? And so that wasn't what we needed to do. The dialogue that came out of this ended up being, deeply provocative and healing. I think that around what it meant to belong, around what it meant to be in community, and the sort of the emergent dialogue that came out of being in this space, in this sort of sandwich between medicine, medicine ceremonies, ended up being deeply profound and healing for some of the people in the group. And I think that it helped us to really understand the importance of belonging, and thinking about that and figuring out how we can address these feelings, how we can watch out for them as they may emerge in different containers that we create, and how we can help to cultivate a sense of belonging in community in these containers, without sort of asking people to step out of who they are. You're muted.
Thank you, Shelby.
Can I say something just to that belonging piece? I imagine that in that group, when you brought that up, that there was just a lot of grief about how familiar it is to not belong for those people, right? Like that wasn't the first time they didn't feel they didn't belong. And I think that is often what gets to shift us to learn what we really need to belong, is that we have to grieve like how often that's actually not the case. Like there aren't many people in our culture who say, I feel like I belong someplace, who haven't created a chosen family or created that for themselves. And so I'm just noting that you couldn't have learned what they really needed until there was a space to be like, it's okay to like feel the absence of that. And I think psychedelics for me has done that it's constantly like, it's okay to grieve you didn't have that, and it's not your fault you didn't have that. And now you get to decide like, okay, then how do I get it now? Because I'm now really able to face that I'm missing it. And other people are missing it, and it's not just me.
Absolutely. I think that this is one of the reasons why we feel it's so important to create containers of queer containers for this work, is because of this, is be able to identify with other people who have a different but maybe similar story. I'm not alone in this. I'm not the only other person who doesn't belong. And I think that there's also, trauma and history that goes beyond this. There definitely many people have had these experiences of not belonging, right? And I think there's a truth of that moving forward, and there also may be a story of that, just this perpetual story of I don't belong. And so being able to sit with that and understand that, and even just believe that like I can belong, that was a really powerful. It seemed to be a really powerful, learning and sort of group, process.
And for me, what stood out is just this common experience that even coming into, I believe what you mentioned, a queer, gay, male retreat, the people showing up, checking all of those boxes still feel inherently like they don't belong. And so, yeah, it's something we all experience. Kind of moving into the clinical space. I was reading Queering Psychedelics, Alex, and the book notes about the ways that, we've been harmed by the heteronormative application within the medical setting. So that's like coming in and checking male or female, or coming in and fitting into these boxes that Florie had suggested. Could you kind of share quickly about, what that's done, and perhaps, I know you're working even on a new treatment protocol, maybe what you think could be done as we move forward to alleviate this and make it more queer?
Yeah, I guess there's like reformist and revolutionary strategies, because like to Florie's point, the medical industrial system is designed around making people fit into predetermined pathways. There's a lot of that. Although I think I will also say I think there are a lot of really incredible clinicians of all stripes who are doing, person-centered work that's really still beautiful. I just want to pick up on this belonging point, because while I was doing psychedelic research at NYU, my dissertation research was with lesbian, gay, and bi kids, adolescents, and we did the largest ever multi-year prospective survey of LGBT youth about suicide and how to prevent suicide. And there's this idea in psychology called the interpersonal theory of suicide that Thomas Joyner and others have developed. And it basically says if you have two things, you perceive yourself as a burden, perceived burdensomeness, and you have thwarted belongingness. It's a sense that you have been thwarted from belonging in your family, your community, your school, your culture, that this leads to a desire to die. And that if you combine that with something called acquired capacity, which is that you've been exposed to painful events, sometimes through physical beatings or others, or bullying or harassment, or other physical events, you acquire a capacity for pain, that this leads not just to desire and willingness to die, but actually the means to take action from suicidal ideation to suicidal behavior or action. And this theory, the interpersonal theory of suicide, is centered around belongingness, or how the culture thwarts people from belonging in lots of ways. And it was borne out. It's statistically meaningful. It's an interesting way of understanding this. And it's particularly applicable to target oppressed groups who perceive themselves as a burden to their families because they're not going to have kids, or they're not going to get married, or they're not going to fit the straight cis mold, and that they feel a perceived burden, but also thwarted belongingness, not just to the straight society, but also in the ways in which queer culture repropagates that. Most of the queer people that I've worked with clinically, the biggest source of stress for them is the sense of perceived not belonging in the queer culture, because the queer culture, we perpetrate the same forms of rejection, harassment, violence, judging, cattiness, smallness, criticism, shade, tea, and forms of traumatic violence against each other in the community. And so the communities are not safer places for a lot of people. In fact, they oftentimes concentrate and propagate difficulty for people, although there can be, obviously, and I have found as a queer man, beautiful spaces, and co-created and co-generated them with others. In the clinic, in the psychedelic clinic, you know, like, it's just, we have a long way to go. I asked ChatGPT, our favorite, you know, mirror lens on culture today, to create a course on psychedelic clinical work, and it came up with, you know, 5 classes, 3 readings per class for a graduate level seminar. And I looked at the readings, all 15 readings, and I was like, oh, those are all like good, solid, like useful primers on psychedelic research and science and therapy. And then I looked at, and I was even in one of the papers, but all 15 authors were white, cisgender, straight men, all 15. And I was like, this is not a diverse, how is it that the data that fed the algorithm like spit this back out? Because there's so much incredible contributions from women and queer people and BIPOC folks. Like, why is it that the LGBTQ, that the system is dominated by people of the dominant identity so completely? And I'll close by saying what you asked about, which is, I think that we can develop affirming therapies broadly, more affirming therapies, not perfectly affirming, and then specifically LGBTQ affirming therapies to address sexual and gender minority stress processes, particularly about what it's like to be in a body in a culture where we've received thousands of messages of rejection over the course of our lives, and how that's affected how we cope, how we've survived. And to do that with psychedelics, and to develop those therapies of, by, for, and with queer people. I looked at the work of Dr. John Pachenkis, my former boss at Yale, who's doing this work with queer people, with gay and lesbian queer women, and with men who have sex with men and gay men, and with trans and gender nonconforming people, like, to think critically about how we can develop interventions that are actually about that in particular, not just about like generic depression, because like, what is it, like, that nomenclature is not always the most helpful way of understanding systemic trauma and its various manifestations. So I'm excited for that. There's no money for that. If you want to put some money up for that, maybe we can do that. But I think that potentially it's an area that could be funded in the future. And I think that the community, as it always has, may have to figure it out. But I'm hoping that there's allyship with straight folks and with straight funding priorities and other ways that might move this along in allyship with other targeted groups.
Thank you, Alex. You know, Bia, you've had a relationship with psychedelic medicine, specifically in indigenous spaces, for over 25 years, I believe. And so I just love to like pass it off to you for your perspective around this concept of belonging within the realm of psychedelic medicine, and what you've witnessed and what you're hopeful for.
Yeah, thank you. I'm still learning a lot of the categories that, you know, people use here in the US, like safe space and belonging. It's not, I'd say it's not like the psychedelic cultures I come from don't use exactly that vocabulary, but I'm learning all of this. And I think, you know, I'm going to throw my 2 cents by saying whatever I want, which is the following. I think that the idea of like, sometimes people feel they don't belong, but if you decide to stand up against something that you think is wrong, everybody feels they belong to that feeling, which is like protesting things that are absurd that are happening. So a lot of people are like separated and don't feel part of the same thing and feel weird. But if you take the lead and you protest and call out something that is aggressive, a lot of people line up and feel identified through that. And so that has been something that I have done a lot. And of course, it has a toll and it has a price, because you kind of pick up fights with important people, and that is kind of complicated. But particularly my own trajectory, I have been really dedicated to like calling out sexual abuse in ayahuasca circles. That is something that we did for a lifetime. And I created a lot of enemies, including among important religious leaders and shamans, because of stepping up and talking about it. Since I think 2010 was the first time I went on stage talking about this. And the amount of like solidarity and union and sense of shared belonging and shared alliance that I received was really impressive, because there's all these people having similar feelings, but not knowing how to articulate that very well. So it works as a kind of sponge to bring people together. And something that I have also done was to call out homophobia and discrimination, prejudice against queer people in the ayahuasca world. It literally cost me like 25 years to be able to do that. I remember in the first psychedelic science conference that I was in 2010, I asked a friend to plant a question in the audience about the UDV having a manifesto against homosexuals that they read during the ceremonies, saying basically, you know, that the only legitimate family is like a straight heterosexual family. And then they have all this like secret document that they read saying that, you know, they're against gay people because that would be the end of the human race. And, you know, it's an aberration and stuff like that. And nobody was talking about this. And it was, you know, in Brazil, I had years and years and years of fear of bringing this up. Also, I was an ayahuasca researcher and felt that if I mentioned that, I would be rejected to doing research in the field, and nobody would want to have me attend their rituals. And I felt so much fear to raise these issues, fear to being rejected as a person, fear to being rejected as a researcher. And so now I think this is also changing. We also, you know, named things like, for example, the fact that the main leader of the Taquihuasi Center in Peru, Jacques Mabi, has made really ugly homophobic declarations. And there is this kind of complexity because Taquihuasi has healed a lot of people. It's a really pioneer center that brought a lot of good to the field, and, you know, is notorious for trying to combine Western psychotherapy with ayahuasca shamanism, and has a very pioneering role in the whole expansion and globalization of ayahuasca. But at the same time, the main leader is saying stuff like homosexuals probably, you know, had like come from context of incest or sexual abuse, like really bad, outdated views on these matters. And then you have a bunch of researchers that are doing research about Taquihuasi and don't mention this. They just talk about how Taquihuasi can heal drug addiction, and how of an example of a combination of psychotherapy and Western psychotherapy and shamanism, how beautiful it is and how progressive it is, but mention zero about any of the other problems. In the more recent conference, you know, I brought this topic up, and the researchers that are doing research about Taquihuasi, they no longer feel comfortable in just publishing the results of their research without mentioning anything around the homophobia. And so I think something important that we have to do in this movement is to stop being silent around certain kinds of abuses that we see in the field, and also calling the attention of researchers that you can't do a research that is entirely autonomous to the positions that certain leaders take on these matters. And I think that's really delicate, because a lot of people in academia, they really don't, they think it's too political or too controversial or too aggressive to get into these arenas. So we have to educate researchers themselves that talking about this, you can't do a research that silences to this. Like, you can't detach certain things from your research results. And talking about those things has to go to the peer-reviewed articles, and there needs to be space. And you can't do research on public health without wanting to get onto those things as if they don't matter, because they do. So that's my 2 cents. I don't know if it makes sense.
Thank you so much, Bia. Everyone, we've got about 10 minutes left in the webinar today, so I want to give each panelist a chance for some closing remarks, a message they'd like to leave the group with, or final thoughts on what we discussed today. Also, feel free, panelists in the chat, to drop websites, Instagram, anywhere people can find you. We'll be sending this recording out to everyone as well, and we'll include that, but that's an option as well. So Alex, I will pass it off to you.
Wow, one of the things that I loved about being an editor of the book Queering Psychedelics, and if you're interested, please share it, read it. It's 42 chapters, or 42 different authors speaking about a really broad range that's even much broader than this panel has been, looking to the ways that psychedelics can relieve internalized homophobia, and how can we get gay men who have problematic uses of crystal meth off of crystal meth and onto 2CB or other psychedelics that might have aphrodisiacal qualities, to radical queer underground ceremonies with hundreds of people taking psilocybin mushrooms that have been totally undocumented up until now, or relatively undocumented. I think that there's quite a lineage of queer people and crossover with psychedelic consciousness in medicine, and I'm not a cultural anthropologist, or a historian, so I will leave that to the experts there. But I am excited for the field of psychotherapy and psychedelic psychotherapy. I will close by saying there is a lot of and this should come as no surprise to anybody, but really entrenched in terrible classism, sizeism, racism, xenophobia, neurotypical privilege in LGBTQ communities. And I don't think that our communities broadly, and I'm not a part of each of them, the broad umbrella, could do a much better job. I think that I could do a better job in working in true allyship with people from intersectional identities, other targeted groups, other oppressed groups. I feel like a balkanized social reform effort is actually not going to help us, and that it keeps us separate. I think that we have a lot of internal reflective work to do, and I also would express a hope at the end of Pride Month that queer people, broadly defined, learn from and do our own work and join forces with, in more meaningful allyship, people from other oppressed groups, and look to leaders who are part of multiple groups. I don't think that has happened to the extent that it should and could, and that's something that I hope and wish for, especially in a psychedelic research world that is really dominated by people who have intersecting levels of privilege from dominated identities, and I think it leads to bad outcomes for a lot of us, and I believe we can do better. So that's part of my intention for the next year.
Thank you, Alex. Bia?
I want to invite everybody that wants to take, we're creating a course in Chacruna on queer issues and psychedelic medicine. It's going to start in August. And I also invite everybody that wants to join Chacruna's membership program. We are a grassroots organization that we are entirely self-funded and made by our community. I think for me, I want to thank again my wife and all of you, and Alex, co-editor with me of this book. And, I consider Chacruna a school. And so we are all here learning together, and we can uplift each other. And for me, the beauty of this queer movement is this combination between fight, resistance, resilience, protest, and also pleasure and joy and fun. And I'm just incredibly blessed, to stand on Chacruna stage in Psychedelic Science 2023, and I propose to everybody to stand up and shout Happy Pride, and that there was this powerful moment that we all just screamed together Happy Pride, and it just feels so good to continue to affirm this. And so there is a lot of pain, there is a lot of shame, there is a lot of injustice, there's a lot of oppression, but there's also the resistance. And the queer movement has been a pioneer in changing, society at large. And it can continue to be, and queering the psychedelic movement is fundamental for this future of this mainstream of this movement, because also that conference was pretty intense, the amounts of craziness going on there in a bad way, of like fake projects and fake experts and fake capital and things that are very opportunistic and ungrounded and not based in community or in any kind of experience or any kind of firsthand relation to this field. So there's a lot of things happening, and I think the queer portion of this movement can help keep the mainstream honest and accountable. So I think we have a big role to play. I invite everybody to continue and support. And again, big hug to all of you, and thank you for the invite to participate.
Thank you for being here. Florie, St.Aime.
This was fast. I feel like we didn't touch on so many things, but I think what I want to end on is a reversal that I think is important for queer people and for the non-queer people to remember that they don't feel like they belong either, right? Like they're creating all this because they also don't feel like they belong. Their belonging comes from their being an other. And when we accept that we're the other and they're the normal, it helps them feel like they belong. That's actually like the real work here, is like continuing to normalize them. It's actually less about othering us. And so I think with that note, I think there's just so much that we can be actually turning away from them and like going towards queerness in all the ways that have looked, all the ways people have worked outside of systems, all the ways people have worked outside of normal, all the ways that people have practiced being defiant, and not defiant only in like fight, but defiant in being, how they show up, the ways that people have made us uncomfortable, the people that have made us feel like they should, whenever we feel a should, we should look at like, oh, wow, there it is in me. Because every time I feel like a should is actually a reflection of, I want to be the normal one here. And so I think we have a lot that we could turn away from the cisheads who are writing all the books and who all are like creating all the clinical studies and trials and stuff. We can actually turn away from them and be like, oh, you're trying really hard to make you normal, but actually I have a lot of other models out here of I don't need that validation of normalcy, and I can learn how to do something differently than trying to fit into your ideas. And so I really want to end on, we don't belong, but they don't belong. And we shouldn't look to them to help us figure out how to belong. We should be looking to ourselves.
Amazing, thank you. Shelby?
Yeah, I mean, I'm feeling inspired. I think that after coming off of the heels of psychedelic science last week and also this conversation, it feels like there is a rich mycelium and network of people looking for ways to support growth through psychedelic medicine, specifically for the queer community. It's great to see just in this conversation, researchers and anthropologists, therapists, practitioners, creating opportunities, wisdom practices for the queer community to leverage these medicines for their own growth, to find belonging for themselves in the context of a world where we don't belong. And to accept ourselves in light of that, that true belonging is being able to radically be yourself, finding the places where you can be yourself and still belong. And so, it's great to be a part of people who are looking at this, who are looking at how we can create spaces of belonging, how we can incorporate these medicines. And so, I'm inspired for the path forward, and grateful for this conversation today. Thank you, Kirby, and thank you to everybody else.
Yeah. Thank you to all the panelists here today. I'm so inspired. I learned so much. I'm also bummed because I had so many more questions I wanted to ask, and I feel like we didn't get to everything. So that's only a case point that we'll need a longer conversation next time. Thank you all for your insight. Thank you to the audience. Thank you for coming. Thank you for showing up, for asking your questions. And happy Pride, everyone. It's 10:30 on the dot, so we did it. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again to everyone. And we'll see you next time.
Happy Pride. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Happy Pride, y'all. Bye.